Okay, welcome everybody. We'll get going with the last bit. Last week of a whirlwind of infectious disease. So as I said last week, I think about a lot of like important infectious disease with respiratory tract and digestive systems where there's numerous types of infections and morbidity and mortality as we think about some of these details. And as we move into the GI tract, you will see there is a long list of some potentials and numerous things that we may think about that may help to kind of ensure some of our safety when we think about handling food and things like that, and maybe preservation. We touched on some of those details before when we thought about like, salting or drying or other things like that, that hopefully set the stage that our GI tract doesn't get bombarded with all sorts of pathogens. So oftentimes when I think about some sort of GI issues, and it's probably not just me because that's right where we're starting. I oftentimes think about some bad E. coli infections, and one top of the list is the 0157H7. This is a pretty common bacteria that we see in livestock. And some of that might be their diet that lends to this specific strain being more common. There's also some transfer, some horizontal transfer lending to some of these virulence factors, which are these O and H abbreviations or numbers, not abbreviations, that signify specific things. And in this case, we call this a Shiga toxin from a friend Shigella, and lending to some other more ill effects when we truly think about E. coli. There are all sorts of strains of E. coli. We have E. coli living in our gut. We call that one K12. And that bacterium, we would like to have it there. It helps to keep us healthy. It synthesizes vitamin K, among other things, but that's a big one as an essential blood clotting factor. So not all E. coli is bad news, but it truly depends on some of these circumstances. When I think about this, I oftentimes think about situations, foodborne illness situations, where things like meat, hamburger typically is one of the main culprits for potentially coming in contact with this. And in the process of making the ground beef, the potential as that animal is being prepared, the potential for some fecal contamination on some of the meat products could be truly a potential, all right? And with that said, if some of that happens to make its way into the pieces that will become ground beef, well, now it's incorporated through a massive amount of this product. And that sets the stage for issues, right? That's usually what I sort of think about with these guys, but we have definitely seen progressions with 0157 and other E. coli's, along with other GI bacteria, becoming problems with all sorts of other things. And we think about produce with potential contamination, all sorts of products that you've probably heard of illness being the result of, or recalls because of illness, one way or another, and lots of things. And like I said, not just E. coli. There are other bacteria that fit the list of potential foodborne issues, like listeria and some salmonella. All three of these have been culprits in some pretty big recall, food recalls. So here we could see some of these pearly fibers. It's like little Velcros, I sort of think, that helps them form some biofilm, helps to lend to a progression of disease if they can get in there and take hold. And there is the text will mention get into some details with that in a minute, but all of the different types of kind of pathogenic strains of E. coli. There's a kind of short table that goes through and talks about some of those details. It's not something that's in here. So the GI tract is a very large system within our body, starting at the mouth and moving all the way through to the anus, with numerous potentials to find good amounts of organisms, and some where maybe not so much, like maybe thinking stomach as an example, although we have seen some Helicobacter pylori, a little bit about that, talked about it. We will see some more of that today. So all sorts of different potentials as we think about this for colonization of normal flora. We think about some accessory organs that help to aid in digestion and some possible issues with infectious disease and impacts to some of these other organs as well. So I'm not going to go through great details of all of this stuff, but ultimately we start thinking about not only bacteria, but digestive enzymes within the salivary glands that help to start this process. And in turn, maybe dependent upon diet, breaking down some of these carbohydrates, releasing simple sugars that in turn, some of the organisms within our mouths are like, sweet, that's exactly what I wanted, and lends to maybe some flourishing organisms that maybe we don't necessarily truly want in this habitat, lending to dental caries or cavities. And we'll go through and talk a little bit about some of that stuff, although really pretty brief, a little bit of detail of that. So we will get to some of that, but quickly some anatomy. We'll look at the tooth real quick, and there are numerous things we will come back to and think about the progression of some disease that lends to problems with the tooth or the gums and roots as we maybe move deeper into it. So in a healthy mouth, the gums coming up around the tooth, there's a nice thick enamel coating that's providing protection. And it's when this really starts to break down that we've got the potentials for definitely for problems. We can see receding gum lines. We can see organisms drilling through the enamel, ultimately degrading it with acid products in their fermentation pathways, like our little ferment tubes that we looked at, those phenol reds, and we saw things that could ferment, turning those tubes yellow. That in turn is indicating an acid byproduct in this process that can basically bore through this lining. As we make our way in, that's where we start seeing issues, and we will move in and see details of this in a bit. So a image real quick of the intestines, and as we get in here and we're looking at the small intestine, this is where we see massive amounts of nutrient absorption within this organ, and a lot of it is the result of huge absorptive area that's been enhanced by all of these little finger projections called villi. And the villi enhance that absorptive area, as we can see in this cross section of the small intestine. There are cells that in turn also are secreting some mucus within this microvilli layer. So that's what we're seeing right here, as we've got a cross section right in between. This would be the lumen of the intestine, where those nutrients would be starting to get absorbed, and this the intestinal villi and the goblet cells that are secreting this bit right here is the mucus layer that we can see lining the lumen. So back to the tooth. There are lots of things happening when we think about the progression of some tooth decay, a handful of stages. And I know there are a good chunk in here that are thinking stuff like this with dental hygiene or dental school, one way or the other. And truly only just a small little tidbit of details with this in here. So we think about some of the initiations with some players in the mouth, potentially players in the mouth that may lend to the progression, all right? Streptococcus mutans is one of the main bacteria that we think about setting the stage for some tooth decay. And these bacteria pretty good at producing some capsule layer. That really is the foundation of this biofilm formation. And they help to participate in this kind of community where they start laying down this foundation, this substrate, the sticky glue that in turn lends to kind of a shield for some bacteria that are more anaerobic and like to do some fermentation. Being encased in this capsule layer lends to their enhanced activity and cavity formation as we see some of this decay. So we could see plaque forming with this biofilm formation, and that in turn progressing, lending to issues at the gum line and again to this cavity formation. So we can see moving through the enamel layer, getting down into the dentin, and then ultimately where we can see the nerves and causing, that's maybe potentially when we first really start recognizing it with some pain. There are possibilities for it to cause abscesses where we see bacteria moving down deeper, and that can cause other problems as we get into the jaw as well. So as we progress from the initial plaque, we could see tartar as it builds up this dental calculus at the inside of the mouth, and some staining as well. And we can see a handful of others. I am not sure if we're looking at the same thing, but my gut says we really are seeing this progression. I think probably the same, as we've got the X-ray looking at it, and we can see where this erosion has occurred. So little hint, drilling into it, removing it, getting rid of all of the bad, and then filling it in, which we don't see that last little bit, but that would be the next step in the progression of this. And maybe we're looking right there. So some gingivitis is the redness and irritation as the result of the plaque and tartar buildup at the gum line, and then that can cause some periodontitis and the gums start to recede, lending to the enamel layer that's been covered that's covering the root of the tooth. As it recedes, we start getting to the point where there is no enamel covering that, and that causes bigger problems. That's what we're seeing at the advanced stage over here, tail end. So the first image we looked at the start with the healthy gums, and then the progression through here from gingivitis, the first stage, and then periodontitis as we move from initiating to advanced stages and potentially lending to some tooth loss at this point. Here we can see some more with this, and this inflammation and erosion. This we call acute necrotizing ulcerative gingivitis. It's a mouthful. ANUG. It's also called Vincent's disease. We'll see that in a second. And I can't remember the genus, but Vincentii we'll get back to it. So we also call it trench mouth. And apparently it's kind of stinky. You can definitely tell if a individual's coming in, the hygienists are like, you could smell it. And it kind of makes me wonder, right? Not so good. All right, we've talked herpes. We showed it on skin before. Since we are thinking GI tract, we're flipping it right back. So cold sores. We also can see gingival stomatitis, as we can see it at the back of the throat. So multiple potentials with that, and this truly more why we're thinking putting it in here. With our candida, the candida albicans can cause an overgrowth in the mouth. We call that thrush, and we can see all of these patches of growth. A lot of this would be the candida, but some of it is also some white blood cells, pus. But a lot of it is the yeast itself. It's something oftentimes with little kids, a kind of common infection that they see just as they're getting stuff figured out. This kid, I tell you what, he is probably the poster child for mumps. I have seen this image repeatedly in our open stacks. You can search some stuff up, you'll see it. I've got a medical dictionary at my house, same picture. I'm just like, wow, that's kind of crazy. Whatever, that's beside the point. Every time I see this, I'm just like, it's interesting. All right, so with mumps, we could see this parotid swelling, and that is one potential symptom as we think about this. It is within the GI category, and we will talk about the progression with that. Vaccines, the MMR, measles, mumps, and rubella, the two types of measles and mumps fit into that cocktail vaccine. And we will move in and start thinking GI stuff really as we get in here. This first bit is really more oral stuff. So, which I think is what we've got up there, but you can't see it because my little bar is blocking it. So I've mentioned with dental caries, Streptococcus mutans is the main player that we think about with it. There was, I've mentioned some of the micro lab, like the end stuff where we did bacteria of the body and looked at different things. There was one type of media that we would use where you would basically, it was kind of gross, kind of interesting. You would spit on this plate, a kind of good amount of spit needs to go on the plate. You'd put the lid on it and you'd slap it in the incubator with right side up, not upside down like we put everything else in there, because the spit's just going to kind of sit on there. And if Streptococcus mutans is present, it starts to grow and it gives you these colonies that are all raised up and kind of blackish. It looks like burnt sugar is what they describe it as. What I think it looks like, I mean, burnt sugar kind of, whatever. It reminds me of at the 4th of July with the little snakes that you light and they start to grow, right? Just as that's starting to grow, that little bit of carbon as it's starting to, do its snake thing, that's how those colonies look. Just weird black blobs is kind of how they are. Weird. And we would have a whole lab full of students spitting on these plates, and a good chunk of them would show this growth and a few of them not, right? Some of us carrying some mutans and some not, right? And probably if you were to truly ask those people, my gut says the ones that didn't have that stuff probably don't really have cavities going on, right? but hard to say, all right? I think most of us probably go to the dentist and you find yourself probably getting a cavity filled. I don't know, all right? I know with, sealants and stuff like that, that definitely seems to maybe provide some levels of protection. I know with both of my boys, it seems like much lower on the spectrum when they go in. They're usually all good. And I don't know if the sealants truly are the answer to that or not. They're young boys. Brushing is some, they brush their teeth, but are they really doing a great job? Maybe, right? I don't know, maybe they are. We could see lots of issues with this: discoloration, softening, and then ultimately cavities. So it is potentially some normal flora. And like I said, potentially, right? Gingivitis and periodontitis, porphyromonas, streptococcus, back up to the mutans, and actinomyces are all culprits in this, and potentially interacting together. There's lots of different situations with this inflammation and erosion. There's possibility of bleeding. The tooth can get loosened and maybe even fall out. So another one that we think about, normal stuff in your mouth that may lend to this. Porphyromonas gingivalis is the name of this bacterium. And I read an article a while back that was speculating that potentially this organism may be the culprit in Alzheimer's, where they could see signatures of this bacteria within the brain. There's toxins that may be stimulating some of the symptoms, and potentially this may be the smoking gun. I don't know. I feel like if that were truly 100% the case, we'd hear more details about that. So maybe it was something that they see signatures of, but not truly the culprit. I don't know. I'll see if I can find that and maybe post it on Moodle if you're curious. We saw the gingivoosteitis, the herpes simplex type 1, where we could see lesions in the mucous membranes. Mumps, a paramyxovirus. We saw the kid with the swollen parotid glands, but there's headaches and muscle ache, weakness and fatigue, potential for encephalitis and meningitis. So another possibility to see these later in the nervous system. And then other possibilities with inflammation of ovaries, testes, and breasts. There are lots of issues way back in the day when mumps was something that we didn't have vaccines for, that if you contracted this, you typically found yourself sterile. And numerous people with fertility issues as a result of mumps in early childhood. Kind of crazy. So this is a droplet transmission or contact with saliva from an infected individual that runs to those issues. And like I said, there is vaccine that we see with it. Oral thrush with the Candida albicans. There are some other Candida organisms, but albicans is a big player. And we saw those images, pseudomembranous patches. The trench mouth, Prevotella, Fusobacterium, and Treponema vincenti. These are some of the players with that: erosion of the gums, pain, swelling, and halitosis. So it's not so good for sure. This typically stuff you already got going on as well, but lending to kind of it thriving with poor dental hygiene. Oops, skipped over that. So I mentioned as I started this, we think about things like maybe proper handling of food that sets the stage to ensure that the potential for some of these foodborne illnesses are minimized. And truly, our discovery of fire and starting to cook stuff up changed things dramatically. We think about our microbiome shifting as we start dealing with cooked things, and the ability to digest stuff easier enhanced considerably. So not only that, but the potential for things to be cooked and not harbor potential pathogens, or to be refrigerated and not lend to potential pathogens growing, are huge, right? So refrigeration also a big help when we think about that. There are some ranges in between 40 and 140 Fahrenheit or 4 to 60 Celsius that we would say is technically the danger zone, where foodstuffs kept at basically right around room temperature-ish and a little bit higher, but room temperature. As we think about right around these ranges, organisms do have more of an opportunity, if they happen to be in there, to grow or to release toxins as the result of their growth, and set the stage for some of those issues. So chilling, freezing, keeping things warmer, or cooking thoroughly helps to ensure all of that. So as we move into this, sometimes that may not be what actually happens, or it could be maybe drinking water that wasn't quite so clean that may set the stage to consuming some of this, or other opportunities to come in contact. Someone with poor hygiene that has the organism that in turn prepares your food could set the stage for these problems just as easily, all right? So this image is a fecal smear where we can see red blood cells, we can see white blood cells, we can see lots of bacteria, and this patient ultimately has shigellosis. Shigella is a pretty nasty GI tract infection. And with that, as we look at this smear, seeing red blood cells and white blood cells in a fecal smear is definitely something that you would say is uncommon. You shouldn't be seeing that. Maybe some white cells, but red blood cells not, all right? And the potential for Shigella to cause some bloody stool, along with a handful of others, like our friend E. coli 0157, these are definitely some issues, all right? And the potentials for serious complications as the result of that. This image, I think, is just so cool. It's a little bit disturbing to think about the ill effects of salmonella, but to see this electron micrograph with some of the bacteria, these are some intestinal epithelial cells as they're trying to wriggle in between them. Really kind of a cool picture. So there are lots of issues when we think about salmonella. Just as I mentioned, starting off with our E. coli and thinking ground beef, I often think salmonella with poultry stuff, chicken or eggs, as big concerns for it, and it definitely is. But there are other opportunities where salmonella can be found. Even potentially in stuff like ground beef. It really kind of just depends on the circumstances. Shifting over a little bit, as we think about some diarrheal diseases, one of the worst I really could imagine has got to be cholera. So Vibrio cholerae is a bacterium that likes kind of brackish water where fresh and salt water kind of come together. Coastal areas, definitely more of a potential to think about some cholera outbreaks. Areas where sanitation is poor, or where sanitation breaks down as a result of maybe a natural disaster, sets the stage for cholera outbreaks. I mean, we could go back to, John Snow in England, and as he's speaking about these, tracing this infectious disease before they ever even knew what cholera was in the first place. It's something that's plagued humanity for a very long time. And when we think about our waste ultimately contaminating where we are using that water, it sets the stage for infection for sure. All right. Lots of issues. So poor sanitation is definitely a big culprit. So here we can see a potential source, right? Maybe doing laundry here, maybe bathing, probably drinking, all of these things, potential issues to bring yourself in contact with the bacterium, all right? This is Vibrio with an electron micrograph. They're kind of curve-shaped bacteria, comma-shaped a little bit. This image I find a little bit disturbing. This room, this hospital wing is a cholera ward where we see all of these cots. There are holes cut in the cot because a bedpan's not going to be enough. That's not sufficient. Bouts of diarrhea in a single day, you might fill this 5-gallon bucket. 20 liters of fluid loss could occur. And that, if you think having that much diarrhea in a single day isn't going to kill you, I think you're sorely mistaken. That's oftentimes how these individuals die, is through massive fluid loss. They go into severe dehydration without lots of fluid replacement. They're not going to come out of it, all right? And it requires multiple bags of saline to ensure that they stay properly hydrated. There were issues with that where they found, they thought maybe they were doing enough, but they recognized you just got to keep pumping it in. Kind of crazy, kind of disturbing. The Helicobacter, here we could see this guy, and it is a definite odd one where it takes up residence in the stomach that should be pretty inhospitable to organisms, setting the stage for things that maybe we consume to get destroyed as they come in contact with the stomach acid. There are other things like, a good handful of parasites that kind of like going through the stomach. It's sort of a first stimulus for that parasite in a cyst or an egg to say, wait a minute, I'm in the gut of something, and that stomach acid stimulates it to start hatching out or existing as it makes its way from the stomach into the intestine. Then it's ready to start growing as whatever it is. So oftentimes prohibitive with the activity in the stomach, sometimes a stimulus for some things, and in other circumstances, the perfect location, I guess, all right? Helicobacter has a handful of mechanisms that ensures its success, buffering capacity that allows it to protect itself as it degrades through that mucosal layer. That's when the stomach acid makes contact with the actual cells, causing pain, the ulcer, and maybe progressing through, making its way to the vessels, where we could think about some bleeding ulcers in those circumstances. Clostridium difficile, we've mentioned this guy as well as a potential when we think about some of the antibiotic treatments, right? And this, as we get to it, was something that was mentioned on the last test with some of the super infection was what it was talking about. And there were some decent things and some things that were definitely a little not quite really there, all right, with what's happening in a super infection, all right? So what happens in that circumstance? This bacteria is already here, all right? This Clostridium difficile is part of our normal flora. And with a super infection, what happens is we deplete the normal flora, all of these colored guys over here, we deplete these guys by taking some broad spectrum antibiotic to target some other infection. And as we are trying to combat that infection, probably not a GI infection in the first place, it interacts with our normal flora in our intestines, wiping out most of the normal flora and leaving these guys that are pretty drug resistant in the first place, leaving them to start to proliferate. And as they start to get an overgrowth and start releasing toxins, that's when we start seeing other ill effects. So the super infection is a different infection on top of the initial infection that you were treating for, that becomes probably worse than what you were dealing with in the first place, all right? And requires all sorts of other issues, all right? So that's really the super infection. You've got it, and then you basically enhance it by wiping out what was there. And it in turn sets the stage for lots of definitely ill effects, producing some pseudomembrane that lends to issues, some malabsorption with that, as it basically blocks some of the absorptive area. And in turn, underneath all of that, they're trying to destroy our own cells and feed on that. And we can see a big influx of inflammatory molecules and white blood cells through the destroyed intestinal cells is really what we're looking at right there. So a lot of different things when we think about GI stuff. And some of these things we can think of as infections, and there are a couple of others that are intoxications, right? Where it's a toxin that organism has secreted, and it's that's making us sick. We may not actually see the bacteria even there, all right? So initially we're looking infections. So the bacteria gets in there and starts causing the issues. Bacillus cereus is a pretty common bacterium. We can see it out in the environment. It's a spore former, but it's an aerobe. And that sets the stage where we could think about some possibilities. Rice might be a good one, where that bacteria may be on the plant. And potentially as the rice is harvested, we can see spores that have formed on the grain, on the rice. And as that rice gets cooked and then brought down to room temperature in that danger zone, the potential for the bacteria to start growing and set the stage for issues is there. So meats, processed meats, and some other things can set the stage for this. And even after cooking, because of that potential for the spore formation, without pressure cooking it, bringing it up to that high pressure and temperature, simply bringing it to a boil or to a steam or just warming it up isn't enough to actually combat the bacteria, all right? Other things that we think about non-spore forming bacteria, well, the idea of cooking something now is definitely more effective, right? Usually, all right? So nausea, abdominal pain, cramps, diarrhea, or vomiting, maybe both. Why not both? So it is definitely a foodborne situation, and we think about potentially trying to figure something like this out in an outbreak situation, maybe a big banquet or something like that, trying to get samples of the foodstuffs that were served may help us to pinpoint what's truly going on. Campylobacter jejuni, this was one of the bacteria definitely that was a main player when we think about pasteurizing milk. This was definitely one that was important to try to knock this guy out. Fever and diarrhea, cramps and vomiting, sometimes dysentery. It can cause organ failure and autoimmune effects. It truly kind of can depend on the age of the individual as far as some of the severity. A lot of this stuff fits that. with young and elderly being more susceptible to some more fatal types of effects as some of the potentials. So unpasteurized milk, undercooked chicken, and contaminated water all set the stage for some Campylobacter. We saw the cholera a second ago, severe diarrhea, fluid loss, potentially lending to shock and death. And we think about contaminated food and water with that. Difficile, we see an overgrowth of the normal flora that sets the stage for these problems, as I just described, and pseudomembranous colitis, diarrhea, loss of appetite, potential for some blood, I would think is definitely an opportunity, as we saw some of that as well. Clostridium perfringens, we talked about this guy with the gas gangrene. It's a potential for some of the skin infections, but it can also be a culprit with gastroenteritis. And we think about maybe getting it with undercooked food, meats that may harbor some of this, and potentially the spores. Clostridium is an anaerobe versus the aerobic bacillus. So a little bit different in that situation. So E. coli, and this goes back to the table that I mentioned, a handful of different types or strains of E. coli. Symptoms vary dependent upon who we're specifically talking about. Usually pretty bad stuff. Watery diarrhea, dysentery, cramps, fever and chills, dehydration. There might be hemolytic uremic syndrome. The 0157 is a potential for that. The EHEC, that in turn causes, with the red cells getting destroyed, causes kidneys to get blocked up. The glomeruli get blocked up with these destroyed red cells, and it causes destruction of the kidney. Depends on the circumstances, but oftentimes when we think about a lot of these, treating with antibiotics may not be the best idea, because it may lend to more of the endotoxin, the outer membrane that harbors that, to be released, causing bigger issues. So it kind of just depends on those circumstances. Helicobacter for the peptic ulcers, Salmonella with our Enterica serotype Enterides. The serotypes are basically looking for antibodies produced against it, and there's a handful of different variants of that where we respond subtly with subtle differences against them. So this is that specific one that causes salmonellosis. We will see typhoid fever, different serotype, different subtype down here, but similar idea, right? Still Enterica, but different, right? So some of what we're seeing is different as well. Fever and nausea, vomiting, abdominal cramps, can be fatal in infants when we think about it. And there's all sorts of issues, contaminated food, eggshells, or animals that have the bacteria can set the stage for that. One of the reasons, if you go to the petting zoo, why you see the hand sanitizer is you're leaving there because there's potentials for coming in contact with numerous things, right? The Shigella dysentery, handful of different players with this, Flexneri, Boyei, and Sani. Cramps, fever, diarrhea, dysentery. There's other potential issues, and even the hemolytic uremic syndrome, which fits back to that 0157, as I said, shared from a Shigella friend, right? This is a food poisoning, so an intoxication. Staph aureus can set the stage for some of these ill effects. It's a bacteria that technically can still grow, not really thrive, but it can still grow at refrigerator temperatures. So it might be important when we think about stuff like dairy products, custards and creams, things like that, undercooked or raw meats, processed meats potentially as well, and in turn the toxins, enterotoxins are what's released and consumed. Typically with this, pretty rapid onset, a handful of hours after the consumption, 4 to 6 maybe 6 to 8, somewhere right around there. Most of these others, it takes a little bit of time before you start seeing the ill effects. This one hits you pretty quick, right? Almost all of these, when you start getting some ill effects, some nausea or diarrhea, your first thought is, well, where did I eat last? What sort of thing is going, and you try to pinpoint it, but oftentimes it might not be the thing you just ate last. It might be something a couple of meals before that's truly the ill effect, right? But when it comes to staph, probably what did I eat last, right? So rapid onset, nausea, diarrhea, vomiting, lasting a couple of days maybe. There's potential for dehydration, definitely some issues, all right? And with this rapid onset and the nausea, diarrhea together, sometimes it's a battle to decide where's it going to come out of first, right? And in some circumstances, both, right? Not so good. Typhoid fever, like I said, different serotype, aches, headaches, nausea, lethargy, diarrhea, constipation, rash, and potential for perforation of the intestine may occur. That could be a fatal occurrence. So fecal oral transmission, maybe something spread by asymptomatic carriers. You've all probably heard the story of Typhoid Mary. If you haven't, you really probably should. I think there's a YouTube video that goes through some pretty cool stuff. I will see if I can find that and post it. Very interesting. She was a cook for a handful of different households. She was a carrier of typhoid fever and in turn infected numerous individuals, caused all sorts of issues. And yeah, very crazy. And she just wanted to keep cooking, right? She had a passion to cook, right? She's like, doggone it, I want to make you all sandwiches, right? And there you go. Yersinia, when I think about Yersinia, I think about the plague, but there's other players besides it. Intercolitica and pseudotuberculosis are important when we think about some foodborne illness. And this also a potential when we think about pasteurization of milk, because these guys also possibilities to contaminate that. So that's important. Generally more mild diarrhea, some cramps, and other issues with it. Oh man, I'm looking at my slide count. There's no way I can get through all of this. I'm like the GI stuff. It's all right. We can make all of this happen. I've got just a couple minutes. Rotavirus right here. These they are spherical or circular, like a wheel, right? Rotavirus. I remember taking a virology course and trying to remember all of the different viruses, and these guys do this and these do that when we're thinking like the pathogenic stuff. Rotavirus, I remembered. I'm like, oh, Roto-Rooter, right? They come clean your drains out. That's poopy, right? And that's where rotavirus fits, right? It's a GI issue, right? So here we can see massive amounts of the virus from a fecal sample. And there's a handful of viral causes of gastroenteritis. Astrovirus, norovirus, and rotavirus, right? And the respective virus culprits. We see some similarities, fevers and headaches, abdominal pain, diarrhea, and vomiting. The norovirus can give you some projectile vomiting, which is pretty hardcore, all right? That's bad news, all right? And this typically pretty self-limiting. Norovirus is a pretty good one, as we see over here, highly contagious. It's a pretty good one when we think about stuff like maybe a cruise ship, where it might be a buffet situation, something like that, where we can see it readily spread. And now you're all in one area, right? Closed quarters. And that sets the stage for a bigger kind of outbreak of something like that. And salad bar things, opportunities like that set the stage for some potential contamination that way, and maybe norovirus. So really just depends. And lastly, with our rotavirus, we can see some recurring infections. This is something that we think about bigger concerns. Lots of them I already mentioned, but children and elderly where they may be more susceptible to some of these things. And rotavirus is definitely on the list for that. Something pretty common when we think about little kids and daycare situations, rotavirus is a pretty common culprit with that. And in turn, they should stay home and not go to the daycare in those circumstances. All right, enough of that. We will talk about some hepatitis on Wednesday. Farewell.